So once again, thank you so much for having me. It is my great pleasure to be here and talk to you about one of my recent projects that has built on one of the projects that I started with Ali Reza when I was a PhD student. And of course, all of you, thank you all of you for coming, virtually coming. And I will start with a general idea of what I've been doing and how the question, like the paper that I want to present fits into a bigger question. And then I will talk for half of my talk about an earlier paper that the second paper was built on, which I think would help you a lot to understand the idea and have a good understanding of the whole question. And as I mentioned, again, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask any questions. I'd rather have you all on board, especially that we don't have any shortage of time, which is very great. So as you all know, we are in our daily lives, we are often encountered with decisions that requires us to learn about cues that specifically predict outcome. So this has been the main idea behind reinforcement learning framework, where you have a mathematical framework to understand how you take actions in an environment in order to maximize your cumulative reward over time. And it allows us, and of course, reinforcement learning had allowed us to understand how animals use their previous experiences to link rewards to the cue and actions that precede them. So according to reinforcement learning framework, learning in a stochastic environments like the one that we live in is very complex. In a stochastic and complex environment like the one that we live in can be very challenging. Specifically, the stochasticity and complexity affect the reliability of an agent or animals of estimate of the future reward. And as this is the case for the mouse that I show in my cartoon. So in my talk, I am going to argue that learning alone is not enough and further computations like adjustment in learning is necessary to deal with such difficulties. So first things first, what is it about learning in real world that makes it very challenging, and how can we have what are the adaptive processes that are required to deal with these difficulties in real world? So I'm going to in my time as a computational neuroscientist, I've mainly focused on two main difficulties with learning in real world. But the question or the paper that we had focuses on one of them. But since I wanted to just give you a big picture and start off with a big picture, I'm going to focus on two main aspects. So the first one is the volatility of the real world. In the real world, as we know it, the associations between cues and actions and their corresponding outcomes change over time, and they can happen with very different frequencies. To give you an example, imagine that you go to a restaurant, the management can change unknown to you. So it means that you have to be constantly learning about, okay, is the quality of the food is still good or not? So that's what I mean by the volatility. There are hidden factors that affect, hidden latent variables that affect the outcomes that you see. And it's usually unknown to you, and they can change with different frequency. In one restaurant, the management changes very frequently. In another restaurant, it changes less frequently. So how should we approach this issue? So let me show you a very simple example. So what you're seeing on the x-axis is the schematic of the reward outcomes that you've received over time on a specific restaurant. A very simple approach for you would be to just average over all your past experiences. But as I give you an example, you don't want your outcomes from a long time ago to affect your current estimate because things might have changed. So you want to put more weight to your more recent outcomes and put less weight to your previous outcomes. But what should be the time constant of this integration is not a very easy question to answer. To give you an example, let's imagine you are in an environment that changes very frequently. So that is the time that you don't want your outcomes from a long time ago to affect your estimate. You want your more recent outcomes to be to have more weight. So, but in contrast, let's imagine. So, before I jump into the next one, so there is an issue with this type of integration. This means that you're going to detect the changes more precisely, but your estimate is not very valid because the more samples you have, the more precise your estimate is going to be. So having a shorter time scale, putting more weight to your very recent outcomes is very adaptable, but it's not specifically precise. So let's imagine another environment. You're in an environment that doesn't change very frequently. So that's the time that you can increase your integration time scale and have more weight to your previous outcomes, to the outcomes that you experienced a while ago. So this means that your estimate is going to be precise because you're integrating over a longer time scale, but it also means that if changes happen very frequently, you're gonna miss this. So this was just a simple example of how simple learning in an environment that is volatile is not enough. So you need to adjust your learning rate. You need to adjust your integration time constant in order to be able to perform well. So there are many other difficulties with learning in the real world, and one of the other one, and the one that we do care for this today's talk, is the multidimensionality of the real world. In the real world, as we know it, cues and actions have multiple features, and each one of them can be predictive of partially or completely predictive of outcome. To give you an example, let's imagine of all the times that we order takeout from a restaurant, what determines a good experience versus a bad experience for you can be food as a whole, as like a single food, or it can be, for example, the ingredients that exist in the food. Some of us like a certain ingredient, garlic. That might be a very major determinant of whether we enjoy the food or not. Is this the flavor? Is this the portion of the food? So while the first one, which you learn the value of each object, is more precise again, because you're learning the value of each individual option as it is not very fast. Why it's not fast? Because you need to consume the same food multiple times in order to have a valuable estimate. So it means that learning a value of each individual food item on the menu of the restaurants, your favorite restaurant, is going to take you a long time in order for you to understand what is the value of this particular option, or is it, do I enjoy this or do I not? However, so this particular method is going to be precise, but it's going to be very slow. On the other hand, if you learn about these particular features in a heuristic manner, you're going to be faster. Why faster? Because each time that you're consuming a food, you're updating the value of multiple options. So you're going to be faster. However, you're going to lose on the precision. Why? Because not all the combination of these features are going to give you the value of a certain food. None of us are going to enjoy an ice cream that has garlic in it. So there is always a problem with these heuristic models, that is that they're fast, but they're not precise. So to wrap up this very first introduction, as I showed you, in dynamic multidimensional environments, learning for the feedback needs to be adjusted. So the question would be, what is adjusted, as in what is the model of the environment? Are you going to learn the value of each individual option versus are you going to learn the value of each individual features? Do you want to be adaptable? Do you want to be precise? And also how much it should be adjusted. What is the proper time constant of the learning, which is the issue with volatility. So for the sake of time, and because you were specifically interested in the first question, I'm going to mainly focus on the what is the proper model of the environment, how the proper model of the environment adjusted. But if you had any questions or you were interested in the second one, I would be very happy to talk about it offline, or you can email me at any time. So let's dive in. What are the factors that affect the adoption of different learning strategies? So I'm calling whether you're learning the value of an individual option versus you're learning the value of these pieces that made them as different learning strategies. So what are the factors that affect these things, and what are the null mechanisms behind these adjustments? So in order to answer this question, we decided to look at two specific learning approaches. The first one, which I'm going to call object-based learning, where an agent learns the value of each individual option that they see in the environment. And then this is very similar to learning the value of each individual food item in a menu of a restaurant. And alternatively, we decided to look at feature-based learning, where an agent or an animal learns the value of the features, the stimulus features. They're usually, for this particular case, I'm going to call these features as the sensory features. Is it color? Is it pattern? Is it shape? Is it a brand of food? Or is it like these ingredients that have a meaning to them in the real world? And I'm going to show you that there are different factors, and this is very similar to the example that I mentioned. Oh, is it Mexican food? Is it seafood? Is it spicy? So these ingredients, these features that have a meaning to them. And I'm going to show you that there are 3 factors that affect how you alternate between these 2 different strategies. So the first factor that I'm going to show you has an impact is the lack of generalizability. What is generalizability? By generalizability, I'm referring to a set of coherent rules that allow you to estimate the value of options using their feature values. So I am going to use the same way of showing reward probabilities assigned to different options throughout the rest of my talk. So I'm going to pause here and walk you through how information is encoded in these matrices, so you will have easier time throughout my talk to understand about the design of the experiments. So in our experiments, usually options have different features associated with them. So here, let's imagine that I have options that have 2 specific features associated with them, pattern and shape. And so P stands for pattern, S stands for shape. And each one of these features can have different values. It can take different values. For example, pattern can be polka dot, can be solid, can be hollow. So we have these different patterns. Here, I'm assuming that pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3, to keep it very simple. And then shape, the same thing. Shape can take different values, and here are these 3 different values. So by each object consists of a pattern and a shape. So I'm putting it in a matrix. So each item that I'm putting here, or each item that has a place in this matrix, is an item that consists of pattern 1, shape 1. So polka dot, red polka dot. I have an item that is red polka dot. And then different colors here are associated with different reward probabilities assigned to these options. And when I call something generalizable, as I mentioned, means that there are a set of coherent rules that allow us to estimate the reward probability of an option. So what does it mean? How can we read it in this particular schematic that I'm showing you? If you look at the matrix on the right side, you will see that these rules exist that allow you to estimate the reward probability. What are these rules? If you average over all the options that have shape 1, you will see that shape 1 is less rewarding than shape 2 on average. Shape 2 is less rewarding than shape 3. Similar thing is true for pattern. Pattern 1 is less rewarding than pattern 2. Pattern 2 is less rewarding than pattern 3 on average. I'm talking everything on average. And using these rules that I gave you, you can estimate the reward probability of all the options in this matrix. Pattern 1, shape 1 is the least rewarding one. Pattern 3, shape 3 is the most rewarding one. So this is an example of a generalizable reward environment. On the other hand, what you have on the right side of the screen is an example of a non-generalizable environment. There are no such rules that can allow you to estimate the reward probability of the options in the environment. So another factor that I will show you affects the adoption of different learning strategies is increasing the dimensionality. As you have options that have more and more features associated with them, and if the features start taking more and more options, that's the time that you're going to adopt more feature-based approach. For a lot of you who are familiar with reinforcement learning literature and the terminology there, it's always called as like curse of dimensionality. That's the time that your state of variables start exploding. When you have it's like an exponential growth as you increase your number of features and your number of and the number of values that each feature can take. And last but not least, I will show you that increase in volatility is a factor that again pushes you into adopting a feature-based approach. So before I start talking in more details about the experimental design and our results, please feel free to ask any questions.
I have one question. How do you define which dimension is more informative? Do you know what I mean? For example, feature 1 has some values, but the standard deviation for the values of that feature is not high value. So this feature is not so informative for making a decision and choosing one option. How we can consider the informativeness of the one feature?
That's a very good question. So as I talk about the specific designs of each experiment, I will give you an examples of the situation that you have one feature that is informative and one feature that is not informative. But in the example that I gave you, both of these features are equally informative in this particular example. But as we go through the experiment, I will show you situations when there is one feature informative and one feature that is not informative. Very good question. Great, but again, feel free to interrupt me at any time. So in order to test this particular framework or these three factors that I'm claiming now, I'm going to show you that are important. But how am I going to test this? So in order to test this, we designed a new paradigm in which an animal here or subjects, participants are looking at a fixation in each trial. They're seeing two options. Each one of these options are associated with multiple features, depending on how we design the experiment. And their task is to learn the reward values or learn the reward values that we put behind each individual option using the reward feedback that they receive. So in each trial, they see the two options, they pick one, they receive the feedback on the item that they picked or on both of the items, depending on the experiment. We played a little bit with that. They receive feedback on one of those things, and their task was to collect as many rewards as possible. So we would reward them based on their performance. We would give them extra money in order to motivate them. And so then what we did, we played with these reward probabilities that we assigned to the different options, and also the number of features that existed in the experiment in order to design environments that had different levels of volatility, dimensionality, and generalizability. So now back to our previous framework. I am going to show you the result of, for the first part of the talk, I'm going to show you the result of 4 particular experiments. In the first 2 experiments, I am going to look at the general effect of generalizability and the effect of volatility. So in the first experiment, I'm going to show you how I designed an experiment that has high levels of generalizability and high levels of volatility. And I'm going to, for the experiment 2, I'm going to show you an example where there is low levels of generalizability and low levels of volatility. So let's keep it simple. For the first 2 experiments, I'm going to show you an experiment that there is 2 dimensions, color and shape. And so and each one of them is taking 2 values. The main reason that we wanted to keep it simple and have it very small dimensions is because we want to look at the effect of volatility. And when you have too many things, you might not be able to get good results in an hour that subjects have the capacity, the mental capacity to participate in the experiment, to do their best, to say. So in the first experiment, we designed a generalizable environment. So now going back to what I meant by generalizable environment was an environment that there were a set of coherent rules that allowed you to estimate the reward probability of each individual option. So this is the reward probability assignment to show you why I'm calling this a generalizable environment. So let's look at the reward probability, the average reward probability of all the options that have shapes that have different shapes. So as you can see, the shape 1 is more rewarding than shape 2. If I average over all the options that have shape 1, the reward probability is 0.6. If I average over all the options that have shape 2, the reward probability is 0.4. Shape 1, using this marginal probability, I can say that shape 1 is more rewarding than shape 2. Now let's look at the colors. I can say that this doing the same thing. I can say color 2 is more rewarding than color 1. But let's see if this environment is generalizable. So I had color 1, color 2 more rewarding than color 1, shape 1 more rewarding than shape 2. And then if I go and look at the reward assignments, this set of rules like very well allow me to estimate the reward probability of the options. Shape 1, color 2 is the most rewarding option, and color 1, shape 2. Can you see my cursor? Perfect. So color 2, shape 1 is the most rewarding option, and color 1, shape 2 is the least rewarding option. Now going back to your question, here I showed you that I have different dimensions that are informative with different like degrees. One is 0.6.4, the other one is 0.8.2. And so this is a generalizable environment. Then I said I want to look at the effect of volatility. So we decided to move from this generalizable reward assignment to another generalizable reward assignment every 48 trials in order to introduce volatility. Now let's see how our subjects behave. What usually people do here is they have a couple of hypotheses. As I mentioned, our hypothesis was that do subjects go feature-based or do subjects go object-based, learn the value of individual objects, or do they learn the value of features and combine them? So a very common practice here would be to fit different models. So I have a generative model. There are 3 parameters in that generative model. I can fit it to my subject's choice behavior, and then I have a quality of the fit. Then I can get that I can compare between these different models. That's one of the issues with like cognitive processes, is that you have to have some hypothesis in order to go and check into your subject's behavior. That's like in a very big comparison to when you're working with simple sensory systems. In sensory system, you know what you're showing to the subject, but in cognitive processes, you don't know what is really happening in the subject's brain. So we decided to look at, again, the feature-based model and an object-based model. What you're looking at is the quality of the fit, shown as the BIC. So the lower number here means the better. Each model that has a lower number means that it did a better job at capturing the subject's choice behavior. So in experiment 1, we saw that subjects indeed adopted a feature-based approach. This was evident by seeing as most of the points that I show you fall above the diagonal line, and also I'm showing the histogram of the difference in BIC for object-based versus feature-based. So in a generalizable volatile environment, I showed you that the subjects adopt a feature-based approach. So yes.
Sorry, what does each point mean?
So each point is the subject. It's one individual subject that we collected the data from. So for a single subject, we collected choice behavior for 400 trials, I think. I might be wrong on the exact number, but for 300 to 400 trials, then I run these generative models. I collect one BIC, I calculate one BIC value for feature-based, one BIC value for object-based. This is a single dot in that plot. So now experiment 2. As I mentioned, in experiment 2, I want to have low levels of volatility and low levels of generalizability. How am I going to achieve that? So this is the reward environment that we came up with. In order to show you that this has a lower levels of generalizability, let's look at the same marginal probabilities again. For shape, now I have a reward assignment that does not have any information in it. Shape in general doesn't give me any information. However, color is partially informative about the reward. Based on the marginal probabilities, I'm going to say that color 2 is more rewarding than color 1. But let's see if this rule applies to all the options. That is not true, because if I look at shape 2, color 2, this reward probability is lower than color 1, shape 2. So even if I look at these marginalized reward probabilities, this is not going to be like 100% helpful to me to know what is the reward probability of each individual option in the environment. Then I can do the same thing. Run these generative models, fit them to the behavior, and then look at this. Look at the results that I get. Oh, sorry. Before I forget, again, the same thing. Every 48 trials, we switch to another non-generalizable reward environment. you may notice that the volatility is the same every 48 trials. I'm switching between these reward probabilities, but based on the volatility of the features, different features that we define, this experiment does have a lower levels of volatility in general. So again, I can look at the subject's choice behavior, and interestingly, in the second experiment, we see that subjects adopt an object-based approach. So the time that we had, high levels of volatility and high levels and lower levels of generalizability, that was the time that our subjects adopted an object-based approach. So let's go back to the same framework that I showed you. For experiment 1, we had high levels of generalizability and high levels of volatility. And I showed that subjects are more prone to adopt a feature-based approach. And in experiment 2, I showed you that low levels of generalizability and low levels of volatility force subjects into adopting an object-based approach. So already I've somehow covered 2 of those factors that I showed you. Now let's see what can we do for the other one. So in order to look at the effect of dimensionality, we designed 2 other experiments. In experiment 3, we looked at low levels of dimensionality and generalizability. And in experiment 4, we looked at high levels of generalizability and high dimensionality. So here in experiment 3 and 4, we are not looking at the effect of volatility for a couple of particular reasons. The first one is that as you increase dimensionality, there is like more options that subjects need to learn. So as I mentioned, a lot of times, at least for the subjects that we got back at Dartmouth, an hour was the maximum amount of time that you could have them sit and pay attention and do well in an experiment. And if you're showing them a lot of options and they need to learn the values of them, having volatility is very discouraging, because by the time that they've learned a little bit, you've already introduced volatility, and that's like they're not going to pay attention too much to the task. Like halfway through, they're going to give up. And another thing is that if you have a very static reward environment, you can also look at the evolution of these learning strategies through time, because now you have more time points instead of like only 48 trials in order to look at, oh, is there anything happening in time or not? And another thing that we did for these static experiments was that we introduced what we call as estimation, reward estimates, as estimation trials. Every tens of trials, we would interrupt the experiment, not very suddenly. We would like show them the subject choice, what we call estimation trials. What do you think is the reward probability associated with an individual option that you're seeing, that you've already seen? Give me, like in 10 percentiles, what do you think is the reward probability of an option? So this was an extra thing that we got on top of the choice, because as all of you might know, choice behavior is very noisy. So this gave us another measure in order to look at what is happening, at what level of learning the subjects are. So now here I'm going to show you the results for the choice behavior and also the results from these estimation trials. But before jumping to that, let's look at the design that we had for experiment 3 and experiment 4. So as I mentioned, in experiment 3, I wanted to look at the effect of dimensionality and generalizability. So we expanded our environment. So instead of a 2x2 reward environment, now I have a 3x3. So instead of 4 options, objects are learning the value associated with 9 individual options. To show you again how this is partially generalizable environment, I have one dimension which I'm calling the non-informative feature. There is no information in that. Everything is rewarding with the value of 0.5. I have a partially informative feature, the pattern here in this particular example, which pattern 1 is less rewarding than pattern 2. Pattern 2 is less rewarding than pattern 3. However, again, you can find options, you can find comparisons that do not follow the inference that you can make based on this marginalized probability. To give you an example, we know, as I mentioned, pattern 3 is more rewarding than pattern 2. But if you compare shape 1 pattern 2 with pattern 3 shape 3, you will see that your inference based on the marginal probability is not going to help you in this particular comparison. Now let's look at our results. our results. So as I mentioned, we have these estimation trials. I'm going to show you the results for that. So what we did for these estimation trials, we used a simple linear regression to calculate the weight that subjects assigned to the estimates based on the feature-based model and to the estimate based on an object-based model. So what I'm going to show you is the relative weight for what came out of this simple regression. Any number below 0.5 means that the subject's estimate were more feature-based. Any number above 0.5 means that the subject's estimate was like more biased to an object-based approach. So as you can see, interestingly, subjects start with a feature-based approach. However, as they go through the experiment, their estimate and their choice behavior seems to be becoming more object-based approach. So this was one of the perks of using a static environment, because now you can look at the evolution of the time, these learning strategies. We can also look at the percentage or the fraction of the subjects whose reported estimates was more correlated to a feature-based or an object-based approach. The same thing, any number below 0.5 means that the subject behavior was more feature-based. Any number above 0.5 means that the subject approach was more object-based. Again, we just wanted to confirm this, that, okay, this is not only a byproduct of like using a simple regression approach. At the beginning of the experiment, subjects' choice behavior matches a feature-based approach. However, as they progress through the experiment, their behavior matches an object-based approach. So another thing is that we have still the choice behavior. Let's look at the choice behavior. We can, again, the same thing. We can fit the choice behavior using two different generative models, the feature-based model and an object-based model. So previously, I showed you a single point, a single number for the BIC of that I calculated calculated for an individual subject. There is one thing that we decided to do is you can also calculate BIC or goodness of fit for each individual trial, how well I'm doing in that particular trial. And then all you can do is stack them for all the subjects and then look at how well these like BIC values progress or how they start differentiating throughout the experiment. And interestingly, we saw that even looking at this like very rough measurement that has like some oversimplifications in it, you will see at the very beginning feature, but here the same thing, the lower number means better. At the very beginning, you will have the feature-based approach providing a better fit. As you progress through the experiment, you will see the object-based approach becomes the model that can capture choice behavior the best. So that was our third experiment. We showed that in a non-generalizable environment, a high-dimensional non-generalizable environment, subjects start with a feature-based approach, but they move to an object-based approach. Now let's see what will happen if we increase dimensionality. Again, we just expanded the environment. Instead of a 3x3 environment, now we're looking at a 4x4 environment. And this is non-generalizable. There is one non-informative feature, and there is one partially informative feature, where there are still mismatches between what you get from a feature-based approach versus what you get from an object-based approach. We can do very similar analysis. Interestingly, in our fourth experiment, we saw that the subjects, again, started with a feature-based approach, but never switched to the object-based approach. They kept using a feature-based approach. We were able to confirm this using their reported choice estimate and also their choice behavior by itself. So now to wrap up everything, I showed you in experiment 3, subjects where there is moderate levels of generalizability and moderate levels of dimensionality. Subjects start with feature-based approach. However, they move to an object-based approach. But as the dimensionality increased and the generalizability increased, subjects stick to the feature-based approach. Again, going back to the framework that I showed you, these two, I provided you evidence that how generalizability and dimensionality are the two factors that affect the way that you move between these different approaches. So that was the study that started the whole. Okay, let's look at there is so much interesting things happening in what is happening in high dimensional stimuli. Before I move on to the next one, I just wanted to ask again: is there any questions?
I have many questions, but maybe I keep it for the end of the.
Sure. Anything that is like would help you, or better to say, anything that you haven't understood so far that I can clarify before I dump more experiments on you or more results on you.
Could you please give some intuition about the object-based model and learning-based, feature-based model? It is not clear for me how to calculate the expected value in the object-based model. Could you please give some intuition?
So of course. So I can go back to the restaurant example that I gave you. In an object-based approach, you're learning the value of each individual item. So every time, for example, you're eating this like pepperoni pizza from that particular restaurant, you have an expected reward from that. And every time you eat it, you will have a feedback saying, oh, did I enjoy it or not? Then you start learning about that particular pepperoni pizza from that restaurant. That's all you're gonna learn. You're not gonna generalize it to any other pepperoni pizzas or any pizzas or that restaurant at all. There's like this particular pizza from that restaurant. However, in a feature-based approach, when you're consuming that pepperoni pizza, instead of updating the value of that particular pepperoni pizza, you update the value for all pepperoni pizzas, for all pizzas, for example, or that, and also that particular restaurant, depending on what is your model. So every time you're consuming the food from that restaurant, no matter what, the value of that restaurant gets updated. When you're consuming this, like once you've consumed that food, you're also updating the value of all the pepperoni pizza, or like your value for the pepperoni pizza in general, or pizza, instead of like an object-based approach, that the example that I gave you. So do you see does your agent looks at each individual features and updates the value of individual features, or does your agent treats each particular condition as a unique condition and not generalize it to other options?
Okay, thank you. But there are two things. The first thing is that how the feedback is given to the participants. Is it separatable? It is separated for each feature, or the feedback is integrated for each option?
So the feedback is very non-specific. In the example that I gave you, in the example single trial that I showed you here, this is exactly what the subjects are seeing. The subject sees two options, they pick one. After a certain period of time, they either receive reward or they don't receive reward. Either that thing turns yellow, which means they got reward, or it turns gray, which means that it didn't get reward. So that's the interesting part of it, is that we are not giving any feedback on a particular feature, or we are not telling the subjects that you have to pay attention to the features. We are telling them, options that you're seeing have multiple features associated with them. You're going to get feedback. Good luck.
Okay, good point. And the other thing is that in the feature-based models, we have some weights for the features. For example, usually I put more weight to the location of a restaurant, but someone maybe puts more weight to the taste of the food. So how do you?
Very good question. That's a very good question. And in that generative model that we are fitting to the subject's behavior, we are allowing different weights for different features. And the result that I'm not showing here specifically is because it's just doesn't fit in the whole, like the story that I'm going to tell, is that yes, depending on the how informative a specific feature is, on average subjects assign more weight to that particular feature. So yes, each individual, when we were fitting that generative model, we tried a bunch of different models, but what we reported eventually in the paper is You have different weights for different features, and you have different also learning rates for different features. We tried different learning rates for rewarded and unrewarded trials, but we reached to the point that we were overfitting the choice behavior. But in order to take care of the fact, okay, subjects might care more about color specifically, because color, we have been primed to assign a lot of weight to the color. Oh, red means stop, green means go. So let's see if this is also showing up, which we didn't see any particular, like, other than like this consistent, okay, the more informative feature is the more, gets more weight. We didn't see any other particular biases.
Thank you, thank you.
All very good questions. Perfect. Then I will dump more results on you. you're ready all. So what I showed you so far was, okay, I showed you how subjects move between object-based approach and feature-based approach. However, these two approaches, it might have occurred to a lot of you that these two approaches are the two very strong sides of the spectrum of the approaches that can be adopted. You're looking at all the individual pieces of an option, or you're looking at that option as a whole gestalt, as a whole thing. So what about, like, whatever falls in the middle? What about these intermediate learning strategies? Are humans learning these intermediate learning strategies or not? To give you an example of these intermediate learning strategies. So going back to the food example that I already gave you. So instead of looking at, like, now going back to the pepperoni pizza, am I looking at the, okay, let's look at the conjunction, the pepperoni pizza from this restaurant. That's an example of, okay, I should add more features to that example. Now that I'm thinking, I've already exhausted that. Going back to this, to the tacos example. Now let's think about the conjunction of, oh, is it Mexican seafood, as opposed to the examples that I showed you where there was like only that particular food, versus was it Mexican food, was it seafood, was it spicy? So do these intermediate strategies, that is like a conjunction or a combination of different features. Are humans able to learn these intermediate learning strategies? So in order to answer this question, we again used our experimental paradigm, and this time we designed a three-dimensional experiment. A three-dimension is the simplest environment that allows you to distinguish between an object-based approach and a feature-based approach, because the conjunction of two features is essentially the object. If I have pattern and shape and I'm looking at the conjunction of pattern and shape, it's an object. However, if you have three dimensions, now you can look at the different conjunctions. Now each option that you have has a particular shape, has a particular pattern, and has a particular color. That's the different features that you have for the feature-based approach. You have objects, you have, in this particular case, you have 27 objects. And you can make many different conjunctions: conjunction of pattern and shape, conjunction of pattern and color, conjunction of color and shape. So that's what I mean by these intermediate strategies. So this was the reward assignment that we came up with in order to show you this is a partially generalizable environment. In order to show you why it's partially generalizable, I can again show you all these marginal reward probabilities. Color is on average not informative about the reward. The same is true for pattern. Pattern on average is not informative about the reward. However, shape carries some partial information about the reward. Shape 3 is less rewarding than shape 2. Shape 2 is less rewarding than shape 3. And importantly, there is another layer of information that exists in this reward assignment that you can also, even by eyeballing it, notice. Notice that in the conjunction of pattern and color, there is some information such that you can see pattern 1, color 1 is more rewarding than pattern 2, color 1. This is true for all the options that have shape 1 and shape 3, but not true for all the options that have shape 2. So by looking at the colors, you will see how the pattern of the colors for all the options that have shape 1 is very similar to all the options that have shape 3. However, this is not the case for shape 2. So this, I'll just show you the numbers because some of us really like to see numbers. I can just like concatenate everything and look at the marginal probability now for the pattern and conjunction. And this is, sorry, for all these different conjunctions. And you will see that for all the conjunctions, all you will end up is the value of the feature, 0.7, 0.5, 0.3 of a particular feature, because there is no information in that specific conjunction. However, it's only for the conjunction of pattern and color that there is some information. And we wanted to see whether subjects can like pick up on this like this partial information that exists in the conjunctions. Can the subjects detect this and learn it as a way of managing or going between object-based and feature-based approach? So what I can do is like very similar, fit the subject's choice behavior using different approaches. So the options that we tried feature-based approach, very similar to the previous ones, object-based approach, what I've already discussed. And now we looked at an approach that learns the value of informative feature and combines it with the value of the informative conjunction. And we wanted to see whether subjects can learn or how subjects' behavior matches these three different approaches. So interestingly, we saw that the subjects indeed can capture that information, they learn the value of the informative feature and the informative conjunction, and they combine it. So what you're looking at is, again, the measure of goodness of fit through time, and you can see that the subject's choice behavior can very well be captured by a model that is feature and learns the value of feature and conjunction. Again, we can look at the subject's reported estimate. And now this time I have three different models. So I'm gonna look at them just using a simple regression, but I'm gonna use a different way of looking at them. So first of all, I can fit these three different models and look at how well each one of them captures. So what you're looking at in the inset is the explained variance of all of these three different models, how well they can explain subjects' reported estimates. And interestingly, you can see again, the feature and conjunction model can do a better job at capturing subjects' reported estimate. I can also go and look at the different pieces of this regression model. So this regression model, the particular pink one, has a feature-based approach, has a feature-based part that learns the value of informative feature and has a conjunction part. Now I can look at how subjects assign weight to them. Now it's very interesting. It goes back to the question that you asked, how these different pieces are weighted. We see that interestingly, subjects learn the value of the feature, the informative feature first, their value plateaus, the weight that they're assigned to it plateaus. However, they're just like keep learning about the informative conjunction at a lower level. So in like to sum up these two results, I showed you that, okay, when you're in a very complex environment, subjects are able to pick up information about these intermediate values, and also they learn the value of the feature first before they move on to learning the value of the informative conjunction. Any questions? Perfect. So now we were also interested, what is the neural mechanism? What is it like a potential computational mechanism or neural mechanism that can lead to this type of behavior? So we decided to use a recurrent neural network model for capturing this, whether we can, what can we learn? Let's see, because recurrent neural networks by design, by definition, they were adopted from the brain. The idea started from the brain. The neural networks started from the brain. Now they've gone all the ways, but we want to make it come back to the brain. How can we do that? So what we decided to do is to put a lot of constraints on a recurrent neural network, on a simple recurrent neural network, in order to make it more biologically plausible. So what did we decide to do? We decided to have a three-layer network. The middle layer is the recurrent layer. The recurrent layer consists of inhibitory and excitatory neurons. And we assume that our input layer is all excitatory to match what we know from biology, that mostly excitatory neurons make long projections to higher level areas. At the sensory level, we assumed that we have neurons encoding whether encoding the feature, the conjunction of features, and the object identity of each particular stimuli. We allowed for, and we assume that the output neuron only gets its input from the excitatory neurons. Again, matching what we know from biology, that all the long projections are mainly excitatory and inhibitory neurons are mainly local. We also assumed a reward modulation of the synapses. So for half of the synapses from sensory units to recurrent units and between recurrent units, we assumed a reward-dependent plasticity. A very simple three-part reward plasticity. When there is reward and when there is activity from pre and post, I'm gonna modulate this particular synapse. So putting these constraints, we just like we train the network. We train the network on a bunch of three-dimensional environments, randomly generated three-dimensional environments. So as you're training the environment, it is not the environment that I showed you for the experiment. All I'm doing is I'm just like randomly generating numbers between 0 and 1 for 27 options, having the network learn this in over 300 trials using this reward-dependent plasticity, and then I'm showing it another environment. But what I'm going to show you is like after I've trained the network, I stop the learning, and then I show it the environment that I showed to the subjects. I want to see now how the trained network behaves in this particular environment. And the idea is that, okay, we have been in the environment, we as humans have been in environment, in multidimensional environment. We have learned so far. Our synapses have gotten to a point that they know how to deal with the task. Now I want you to learn how to perform in this particular task that I showed to my subjects. So the first thing is to look at the output of the network. And interestingly, we see that the output of our network matches very well with our subject's behavior. So this is the weight that the network assigns to different, the network output shows when I use a similar regression analysis. My network gives me an output, and the output of the network is a number between 0 and 1, which is the reward probability. I'm not asking the network to make any choices in order to reduce the noise that exists in the choice layer. I train the network to only report me a number between 0 and 1. I can do a very similar regression for this number for all the 27 options and look and see how well it matches my subject's behavior. So to show you, to go back to the subject's behavior, again, we see that the network first assigns more weight to the feature-based part of it, and then slowly increases its weight for the conjunction. And of course, the network is less noisy. The output of the network less noisy, so the weight is higher. The absolute value of the weight is higher compared to our subjects. So first of all, the first pass analysis, our network can do very similar. It performs very similarly to our subjects in this particular environment. But of course, we train the neural network to understand what is happening in the brain, and this is not the end of a story for recurrent neural network. Now I can dive deep and look at how the neural network is performing in this task. It is a challenging task. It's a challenging aim because the recurrent neural networks are very complex, but we did our best in order to understand how the recurrent neural network is approaching this issue. So we first decided to look at the different populations of the neurons that we had in our recurrent neural network. So as I mentioned, I have a population of excitatory neurons, I have a population of inhibitory neurons. Sorry, I forgot to mention another part that we added is that we put the ratio of excitatory neurons to inhibitory neurons 4:1, because just based on the brain, we know that we have more excitatory neurons. That's also a very common practice. So we have different population of neurons. Why? Because as I mentioned, half of the units from sensory, half of the connections from sensory units to recurrent units, and between the recurrent units are subject to this reward-dependent plasticity. So this leads to 8 independent populations of recurrent neurons, depending on whether they're excitatory or inhibitory. So the first 4 that you're seeing are the excitatory populations. The next are the 4 inhibitory populations, depending on whether their connection from sensory unit to the recurrent unit is modulated by the reward, which I'm showing with this particular sign. So this is the input to that population, whether it's modulated by the reward or it's not modulated by the reward, and whether the recurrent connections are modulated by the reward. So that leaves like 2 by 2 by 2, 8 distinct populations that I have in my recurrent neural network. Now I want to see how they're behaving differently. Is there any particular thing between these different populations that I can pick up on that can help me to understand better how this network is performing? So we decided to use a very common approach in fMRI. It's called representational similarity analysis. I will explain to you what it means, but I wanted to mention for those of you who are familiar with the pipeline or analysis in the fMRI literature. So what you do is you can look at the activity of your neurons. For all your neurons, you have in each individual population, and you can calculate the similarity as for these options. So I show, as I'm very similar to the previous experiment, they have 27 options. I can look at my neural activity for these 27 options, and I can calculate the similarity matrix, as in how similar are this is like, for those of you who want more mathematically savvy terminology, this is like the dot product of the activity. That is, you have a certain activity over your population for an individual option, how similar it is to the other option when you show the other option, when you show the other stimuli. So you can calculate the similarity matrix, and then you will have a bunch of similarity matrices based on different learning approaches. Whether your learning approach was an object-based, whether your learning approach learned the value of informative feature, or whether it learned the value of the informative conjunction. So here I care about the value. So I want to regress my representational similarity that I calculated for each individual population against these representational similarities that I got based on the value of these 27 options. So each one of these matrices are 27 by 27. And for these objects, it's like just the difference between their reward probability. So what I can do, as I mentioned, I have 8 populations. I can do this representational similarity analysis and calculate the weights for it. Let's see what I get. What I'm showing you is the calculated weight. I have 3 weights. I regressed it against these 3 different approaches: informative feature, informative conjunction, and object. And on top of each figure, I'm showing a schematic of these populations, just because it is very hard to show you like all 8, like what I mean by each one of these schematics. So the population, if it's gray, it's inhibitory. If it's white, it's excitatory. If you see a symbol in the input, it means that it's the weights are modulated by reward. In the input, if you see a symbol on the recurrent part of it, means that the recurrent part is only modulated by the reward. So let's look at all the excitatory neurons. Let's see if we see any differences. And the answer is yes. We will see very huge differences between different excitatory populations. The excitatory population whose input is modulated by the reward shows the most modulation based on the informative feature. The informative feature, informative conjunction, and informative object, which is very interesting. Now we can look at our inhibitory population, and we will see that the inhibitory population also shows this differential representation, which is very, very interesting. And more importantly, I want you to compare what is happening in the excitatory population to the inhibitory population. An interesting thing is that the inhibitory population, I'm talking about these two, let's for now focus on these 2 populations. Interestingly, you can see that the inhibitory population has much stronger modulation for the informative feature. However, this is the excitatory population that has more modulation based on the object. So we will see these differential representations, which I'm going to call them representation of the values in these different populations. So the question of this is a very interesting observation. It means that different recurrent units are doing different things. Let's see if we understand more of it. Let's see if there is anything more that we can get to see, okay, what is happening? What is leading to these differential representations? This is just a very nice observation. This is the beginning only. So what is a very simple way to look at it is that this is recurrent neural network. I have access to the weights. I can look at the weights, the connection weights between these different units. Let's for now first look at the input weights, the weights from sensory units to the recurrent units. So these are the average weights that I calculated for 50 recurrent neural networks that we trained. So on the x-axis is your recurrent sensory units. You have 3 populations that are encoding features. You have 3 populations that are encoding, you have 9 of them, but by feature, I mean, okay, the population that is encoding color, the population that is encoding shape. So you have three subpopulations of each. You have another 3 that are encoding different conjunctions, conjunction of pattern and shape, pattern and color, color and shape. And then you have another population that is encoding the object identity. And then I have eight recurrent populations. I can look at the average weight between them. These are the weights before I train the network in the task. So I'm calling them naive weights. As I mentioned, you have a recurrent neural network. You allow the network to be able to adjust its weight. But at the very beginning of the trial, your weights haven't been adjusted. Half of your weights are going to get adjusted throughout the experiment. So this is step 0. When none of these weights have been adjusted, I'm calling them naive weights for now. Let's look at them. Let's see if we will see any pattern. Again, interestingly, we see that their patterns exist. Let's for now look at the weights from feature encoding units to the 2 inhibitory units that I have here, the 2 inhibitory units that have that their input connections are modulated by the reward, and the corresponding excitatory units. We'll see that interestingly, there is a differential assignment of weight. More weight is assigned from feature encoding units to these inhibitory populations as opposed to the excitatory populations. There is another interesting observation that you will see the reverse of this pattern exists for the weights from object encoding units to the excitatory units. And these weights are important specifically because our reward-dependent plasticity method dependent on the activity of pre, post, and the reward. So if at the very beginning you have a very strong weight, your post synaptic neuron is going to have a strong activity. So this means that, okay, this is going to affect our learning. Let's see how it's going to affect our learning. So in order to see how this is going to affect our learning, I'm going to look at how these weights, these are the naive weights, how these particular weights are changing, the input weights particularly, are changing as the agent is experiencing the reward feedback. So these are all the weights that are going to be get changed, all 4 of them. That's the interesting part of it, of course. I mean, it might be trivial at the end, but of course, these are the weights that are important because they're getting changed as well throughout the experiment. But let's see how they're changing throughout the experiment. So what we did is we calculate the rate of change in these weights through time. So what you're looking at is the average rate of change from the same thing, feature encoding sensory units, conjunction encoding sensory units, and object encoding sensory units to these post-synaptic units, these 4 that I'm particularly interested in. And these are the only 4s that have the weights changed. So I know it's a lot of information. I'm going to direct you to the places that are important. For now, let's focus on the weights from feature encoding units to these 4 populations. I can see that the weights from feature encoding units to inhibitory unit is decreasing, is below 0. And I see the weights from feature encoding units to the excitatory parts are positive. So what does it mean? Means that as I'm learning throughout this task, my inhibitory neurons, the weight to my inhibitory neurons is decreasing, which means that if there is any connection from my inhibitory neurons to excitatory neurons, my excitatory neurons are getting disinhibited. And this regression was done based on the value. So I'm regressing the amount that the weights are changing against the value of these particular options, and I'm averaging them here. So let's see which one of them is significant. And interestingly, you can see that the ones that are only for the informative parts are the significant. So what I'm showing in these boxes are the weights from the informative feature, from the informative conjunction and object to the recurrent units. So again, interestingly, it means that there is a value-dependent disinhibition happening from feature encoding disinhibition, if there is a connection from inhibitory units to excitatory units. Inhibitory units are getting this inhibited value based on the value of the feature. However, the excitatory units are getting excited based on the value of feature and also based on the value of informative conjunction, which matches very well with what we see in the behavior, which we saw in the behavior of our network. We had the feature-based part and we had the conjunction-based part. Now so this one is particularly emphasizes or points to the important effect of inhibitory connections to the excitatory connections. Because if there was no such a thing, why would my inhibitory neurons care? If everything that I cared about was my excitatory, what is happening in my excitatory neurons, why would I see differential connection, input connections, and also differential changes in the rate or the rate of change in the weight from sensory input to the recurrent to the inhibitory units? If my inhibitory units are just like there to just chill, there was no point in having the inhibitory units show a value dependent disinhibition. So in order to confirm this, confirm that there is a very important role for this connection, what we did is we decided to, first of all, look at the effect of the importance of these connections. So what you're looking at is, again, the naive recurrent weights, the average naive recurrent weights. And as I pointed out, we care about the connections between the inhibitory units to the excitatory units and from the excitatory units to the inhibitory units. Particularly, we were interested in the role that the connections from inhibitory units to excitatory units play. So we decided to lesion these weights and see what happens. This is our network. We can do whatever we want with it and see how it affects the behavior of the network. And for us to also confirm the causality of the role that inhibitory neurons play in this network. And interestingly, we see that none of those disinhibition exist anymore in our network. Our network is not anymore encoding the value of the feature, is not showing any modulation or any significant modulation with the feature values, with the conjunction values. All we see is that the network is being modulated by the value of the objects, which shows that recurrent connections play a very important role in the emergence of this intermediate learning strategy. One thing that unfortunately I just realized I didn't put, if I start looking at the behavior of the network, looking at the output of the network and do this very similar regression analysis, I will see that my network's behavior is dominated by an object-based approach. So that just confirms that, okay, these connections have a very important role in the emergence of these intermediate strategies. So with that being said, I want to wrap up, and I showed you how the lack of generalizable rules promote object-based learning. I also showed you that dimensionality, high dimensionality, and volatility are the two factors that push you into adoption of a feature-based or more simple learning strategy. And the last part of my talk, the second part of my talk, I showed you that the conjunction-based learning is adopted as an intermediate learning strategy between feature-based and object-based. And I showed the modeling results for you that the emergence of these intermediate learning strategies relies strongly on the contributions of contributions of connection of inhibitory neurons in particular, and the connections between them. And with that being said, I want to thank all the people who made this possible. The majority of what I showed you, or all of this, what I showed you for the first part of the talk was done during my time as a PhD student in Ali Reza's lab. And also a huge shout out to all the undergrads that helped us with the data collection and the conceptualizing the experiment. And the first part of the work was done in collaboration with Daly at Johns Hopkins. And the second part of the talk was during my time as a Flatiron Research Fellow. I was working under Mitya's guidance, but I had a lot of freedom to be able to work on the projects that I was interested in. And thank you all for your attention and for your very good questions. I'm looking forward to more questions.
Okay, many thanks for your great presentation. It was very interesting. Okay, everyone, any questions? I think everyone can ask a question in English or Farsi. Actually, everyone has access to the camera and microphone, so everyone can talk if have any question or comments. Also, anyone can ask their question in the chat. Okay. Yeah, Amir, please.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was very, very interesting for me. And also Mitya is really inspiring for me. I have two main questions. The first one is, maybe it's a naive question, but in your neural model, you did not consider any part for dimension reduction. And I don't know, but I think it has some effect on the results when we add some dimension reduction part, for example, for avoiding the non-informative features. And could you please explain what happens if we add some, for example, variational autoencoder or some part for the dimension reduction? Thank you.
That is a very good question. So this is the most basic model that we wanted to see what is happening in the most basic model before we start adding more parts to it. So that was one of the reasons that we tried to keep it as simple as possible. And first of all, we wanted to see what is happening in the most simple case. So we saw that in the most simple case, like it doesn't have all these, like, okay, intentionally it is not doing any dimensionality reduction. But what I showed you is that by having these differential connections for example, it's from sensory units to inhibitory neurons, you are doing some sort of a dimensionality reduction by having these differential connections. You're having inhibitory neurons learning these intermediate or these simpler features, and if the information exists in them, then you're sending them to the excitatory neurons that are projecting to the output. But you're absolutely right. If you think of it in the like human brain, there might be like, okay, I have the attention circuit. Like let's think of it as what might be happening in the human brain. Oh, I have the attention circuit, and I can have the attention circuit come and modulate and tell me that, okay, I think there is some information in this particular feature. You just ignore it. Why were you just like wasting your energy learning that it doesn't have any information in it? So I bet there is going to be like more things that turn out to be very important in this learning. This was our first attempt to look at the very simple case of what is happening in a single layer. If you ask me, personally, I think this is happening over multiple brain areas. So this is a very naive simplification of assuming that everything is happening in a single layer. But this was our first attempt. There is like a lot more that can be done for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. My second question is related to the attention. You did not, actually did not consider the attention data from eye tracking in your first study, but it's really nice to add some eye tracking data to your study. I'm not sure if this we can capture some pattern from the stimulus that you have used by eye tracking. Can you explain it? How we can extend your paradigm for an eye tracking experiment?
That is a very good question. We did not, you're absolutely right. We did not have, we did not consider eye tracking. We allowed subjects to even like, to look around. Their choice was with the keyboard. So all they could do, they could just like roam around and look at all the stimuli and sample them multiple times probably. I guess a very good question would be like, okay, let's run the same task and either make the choice that they're or like make a saccade instead of choosing with the keyboard, and see if there is any differences in the reaction time. Or alternatively, you can assume that, oh, I'm gonna let them still look around all the time and see if I can see any patterns. Are they looking at the informative feature more often than the other one? Or if not, or at the time that they're doing feature-based, is there any, or at the very beginning of the experiment when they're doing feature-based, do I see any pattern of eye movement that is different when they're doing object-based? That would be they're both very interesting questions. This is like one interesting thing about this paradigm is that there's just like so much that can be explored with it.
Yeah, thank you for your nice presentation and your complete answers. Thank you.
Thank you for very good questions.
Okay, Amin, please ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. This kind of presentation and analysis is new for me, and so that is more valuable. I have some general question. My first question is about the recurrent neural network and Fmri. I think that is the general knowledge which Fmri is related to excitatory, not inhibitory, because in the both inhibitory and excitatory activation, both signal increase and not decrease. I have a question about this. How did you use Fmri to recurrent neural network and to show the weight of inhibitory neurons?
Oh, I did not. We have not performed Fmri yet. So all I wanted to say is that this type of analysis has been done in Fmri. I wanted to just like make the connection. We have not done the Fmri experiment, and I did not know. That's a very good point that in Fmri you get mainly excitatory neurons. But I just wanted to use the framework to make the connection.
I get confused about what is the data?
This
which data do you use for recurrent neural network?
So this is when I train the recurrent neural network, I have access to the activity of each individual unit that I have, correct?
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons we are all that attracted to recurrent neural networks, is because you have access to all these units. So all I did is I treated each one of these units as a pixel or as a voxel. That's all I did.
Okay, thank you. And another question, I think you use the encoding for your recurrent neural network, but I think that for reward stream and reward network, we just focus to the dopamine system and high level activation, no in the low level and encoding system. I'm not sure for reward task we have a different weight for in the encoding brain or in the encoding area. Do you have some explanation for that?
That is a very good question. Again, it goes back to the oversimplification that we've done. So like, we know that when I show you in a stimuli, you're gonna see it. There is going to be some activity in your sensory areas. We made like a huge jump from that sensory area to the higher cortical areas. We skipped a lot of things in the middle. That's like another very interesting thing that can be explored. We just like try to keep it simple. Let's go from one, jump to the next one, and then to the action. So I 100% agree. This is very oversimplification. And for example, there is a lot we know that dopamine is even affecting, I don't know, the sensory representation. Here we assume that the sensory representation stays constant. So again, all of these, you're absolutely correct. Very good question. Very good point. This was, again, the first step. This can be expanded, this can become more realistic. But for now, just like understanding in such a simple case how it performs gave us a lot of insight. And what other thing is that we mentioned it very briefly in our discussion of the paper, that even though that this is a single layer, this can be considered as multiple layers. For example, we make a little bit of connection between, okay, what is happening in the inhibitory neurons and all the electrophysiology literature that show the effect of BLA, basolateral amygdala, in the disinhibiting of all the higher cortical areas. So even though that we're claiming, oh, this is a single layer, you can think of as the single layer as, oh, I'm compacting a lot of layers all together and seeing what is happening.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question is about BIC and goodness of fit. I'm not sure how did you calculate BIC, because at the first time I didn't any model and formulae to capture some simulation data to goodness of fit or to calculate BIC. Can you explain about your model for feature-based and object-based, and how do you calculate and compute BIC?
Of course. So without getting into too much details, I can give you a whole general idea, but still, if you want to learn more, I highly recommend you to read the methods sections of our papers, because we try very hard to make it as understandable as possible. And if you had any questions, please feel free to email me. I would be more than happy to even provide you with corresponding code if necessary. We have soon, hopefully there will be some codes available online. I think email me, I can send you the code if necessary. But the idea is that, so each single trial, all I have from the choice behavior is whether the subject chose left or chose right.
Yeah.
Correct? So I can look at it in a simplified way as 0 or 1. Did the subject choose left? 1. Did the subject chose right? 0. So what the model does in a nutshell is treats this as a binomial distribution. Like this is 0, this is 1. And then the model tries to calculate a probability for whether the subject went left or the subject went right. So if I have a model, then I will tell you why left and right. For now, I'm super simplifying everything. So if my model tells me that, oh, I think the probability of the so my model does is telling me a probability between 0 or 1 of whether the subject went to left or right. So if the subject goes to left and my model tells me that I thought that the subject is going to the left with probability of 0.8, I say, oh, good job, you did a very good job. 0.8 is very close to what actually the subject did, so I'm going to penalize you less. However, if the subject went to right and my model was telling me that, oh, I think the subject was going to left, it was the probability was 0.2, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to penalize you a lot because you were very off. So essentially what the model does is, like, in general, the whole optimization tries to reduce this cost, this penalization that I'm doing it. And the model is very restrict because I am putting in the model that I want you to learn the value of features. You have very few free parameters that you can tune. So all the optimization does is tries to tune these parameters to the best of its ability to be able to be penalized less, to be able to predict what the subject is doing in that particular trial the best. So that's how we calculate these BIC values. That's why the lower number is the better, is because it's the amount that eventually the model was penalized. Now going to the why I'm just choosing left or right, it doesn't need to be left or right. All you need to do is to just somehow make it a binary choice, whether it's 0 or 1 for now, for this particular case, for our case. And what you do is, for example, in your feature-based model, let me go back to our experimental paradigm. So for feature-based approach, what you assume is that in order to calculate these probabilities of whether the subject is going to go left or right, I'm going to calculate the value of the option that is on the left and the value of the option that is on the right. What I think is the reward estimate of the subject, or for the object or for the option that is on the left versus the option that is on the right, For the feature-based approach, you're looking at that as that option as, is it triangle? Is it blue? Is it solid? You have a value for all these things. You assign a weight to these things. You combine them. You calculate a value for left. You calculate a value for right. You somehow normalize it and say like, oh, I think it's going to the left with this probability. And then I'm going to penalize it when I reveal the real choice that had happened. Was that good enough?
Thank you. Thanks so much. So sorry, I didn't understand about object-based. Which one of this shape is related to object?
So these are the shapes that subjects are observing. What I'm calling an object is I'm saying that the subject has a value for this particular option, instead of having a value for a square, having a value for red, and having a value for hollow.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is about the number of subject and trial. I think you are so many manipulation and levels for each of this experiment. How many subject and trial do you use for each of cell?
Very good question. Usually we are limited, as I mentioned, we are limited to attention span of subjects. So as in number of trials, we are usually limited to 400, 300, like 320, 330, like 400 has been like the longest that I've ever collected the data. And then even toward the end, I'm losing subjects. So in terms of trials, there is that. And in terms of subjects, for the experiment experiment 2, we had fewer subjects, as you could see in the number of points that I was showing. For experiment 1, we had, I think, around 40 subjects in total. And also these tasks are very hard. So a lot of times we lose 20 subjects to like, they don't perform above chance. So we lose a lot of subjects as well. But we usually in our supplementary materials, we provide the behavior of the subject. So it's not that we are pretending that they never existed. But we lose, these tasks are very hard. So we lose a lot of subjects. For experiment 1, we had around 40. For experiment 2, we had fewer. I think we had 20 something. For experiment 3 and 4, we had, I think, 30 subjects, and these are non-overlapping. We collected them at different time points. But for experiment, the last experiment, the very recent one, we collected around 80 subjects because it was just a very difficult task. Subjects are learning the value of 27 options. It was very difficult. And we ended up removing, again, 20 of them, but we had like 70 subjects. So we usually try to collect a good amount of subjects in order to make sure that what we are seeing is not just a pattern of a few subjects that we collected.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation.
Of course, thank you for your very good questions.
Okay, everyone, any other questions? Okay, many thanks again for everything, Shiva. I really personally appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It was my great pleasure to be and talk to you guys.
Thank you. I think we can finish the meeting. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.